And I'm the Associate Director of the Center for Engaged Learning, Teaching, and Scholarship, where I run the University Service Learning Program and our faculty development programs. And I am delighted to be joined by my colleagues, Michael Burns from biology and Joe Lukoff from philosophy. And we're here to talk about greeting our AI overlords. To really kind of seriously embrace and chat about what this means for us in education and maybe familiarize you with something that has really, I think, started to hit an inflection point on popular culture. There was literally an article this morning in Inside Higher Ed about ChatGPT, which is something that we'll be discussing. So this is possibly some terms you've heard. I'd invite you all, as we're getting our slides up and going, if you could introduce yourself in the chat, just give us your name, the department that you teach for or work for, and what institution you're from. And with that, I'll flip it over to you, Michael.
Hello, everybody. So I hopefully have been able to share my screen, and we're going to start a slideshow. This is going to be a very interactive presentation. So we're going to be asking you to do a whole bunch of stuff as we go through here. Hold on just a second, the chat's going nuts. The first thing I'm going to have everybody do is actually go to the ChatGPT website. So the cool news about this is that ChatGPT is it's in beta. So this is from a company called OpenAI. I think they're headed towards something like a $30 billion valuation right now. So they're making very big strides. Go ahead and go to the ChatGPT website, and I'm going to do that for us right now. So I'm going to stop sharing, and we're going to see if we're going to be able to actually use this. So when I go to the ChatGPT website, I'm going to refresh it, and I'm going to click Try ChatGPT. And it says ChatGPT is at capacity right now, which has been happening on the regular. So again, this tool, the way that this is interacting, has been so popular that their website has been slammed. So the hope was that we'd be able to get you folks all in here. Again, usually the way this works is you just click, I'd like to go to the ChatGPT website. You log in with an email address, your Gmail, your work email, your whatever, and then you have access to it. No worries though. I anticipated that ChatGPT was going to be at capacity because the semester just started, and because we're talking about it in education, students and faculty alike are looking at this tool. There is a backup plan, and the backup plan is using a iteration of this from the same company called the OpenAI Playground. And this one is the version that is currently rolling. So this one is not in beta. You have to pay for access to this. It's affordable unless you're doing it at scale. So I think I probably racked up about maybe 50 cents worth of time on this playground, but this is what the typical interface is going to look like. It's just a chat box. Okay. So what I would like to do, because we're not going to be able to do this all at once, is I would love to get a couple of examples. So if somebody would like to throw up in the chat a prompt that you recently gave in a class, and it could be literally any class. It could be a STEM class, could be a humanities class, could be whatever. Just go ahead and throw something up there like compare and contrast the themes in Homer's Odyssey, something like that. Explain, here we go. Kristen says, explain the nature of Kant's transcendental idealism. All right, so we're going to try that one. And this is for an undergraduate course, I'm guessing. Probably. All right. So let's see. Yep. Okay. So like, write the response. Oh, and I'm going to make this bigger so you can all see. Write the response as though this was for an undergraduate course. And you click go, and it's going to start generating text. Whoop, there we go.
As we're waiting on it, I was able to get into ChatGPT, so I would encourage folks if you
excellent.
Want to keep refreshing.
Yep. Yeah, and so again, by all means, keep refreshing the tab. So this one, it basically just wrote a little essay here. Okay, so I have no idea if it's accurate or not because I'm not super familiar with Kant, but Kant's transcendental idealism developed by Immanuel Kant, et cetera, it put it together. The interesting thing about this, and one of the big differences, is that this is incredibly flexible, and it doesn't give you the same thing every time. Okay, so when you run this, you know, I can take all this text and we can sort of eyeball it, but I can delete this. And if I run it again, it's something different, right? So it's not cribbing something, it's actually generating new text in response to that prompt. And in this particular interface, you can actually tweak how consistent it is or how random it is with this little temperature gauge here. So if we turn the temperature way up, it's going to be very different from run to run. And if we turn it way down, it's going to be more and more consistent. It's pretty neat. You can also adjust the length, so how long you want it, or you can just manually tell it how long you want it to be. So for instance, I can say this essay should be 1,000 words. Look, it's including some stuff about Kant's. I have no idea. Again, this might be right. Yeah, you can have it write songs. You can have it write essays, responses. Yeah, it can do all sorts of really cool stuff. And again, if you want to go ahead and hop into ChatGPT, you can totally play with this as well. Other examples of things that you can do are you can have it write code. So write some R code to filter and sort a data frame based on values in the, I don't know, 4th column. You can write code for you. It can troubleshoot code for you. It can do all sorts of really cool stuff. Yeah, and there's an argument going on in the chat right now about, can you have it cite sources? Let's try that. So let's say write a research piece on I don't know, P53 in cancer, cite for peer reviewed sources in Nature format. Run. So you can use it to actually describe biological phenomenon. You can, so in other words, this isn't just a humanities thing. It can sort of do this stuff. And hey, look, there's some citations. The big question is, are these real citations or are these complete nonsense? Were these made up? I have no idea. I don't think I've ever heard of the journal Oncology Reports, but let's see. I kind of doubt this is a real paper. This has actually been one of the critiques of ChatGPT. And this is actually a Facebook built and released their own version of a language model like this, I think 2 or 3 weeks ago, specifically for scientific researchers to write research papers. And it was online for, I believe, 3 days before Facebook Meta pulled it, because it was making stuff up. The model was not able to tell the difference between things that are true and things that are just sort of linguistically functional. And it was basically making up a lot of citations. So it is tricky. If you wanted to do citations, I believe you normally have to manually tell it to cite a very specific thing. It's not very good at finding them for itself. Anyway, big picture, this is what it is. And yes, for programming languages, you can have it actually translate code from like R to Python to C to whatever you want. So if you want to do something quick, I used it in my metagenomics class, a bioinformatics class last semester, and the students were able to rely on this to convert pseudocode into code pretty readily. And it works pretty well. All right. What is this stuff? Okay, so what are these things? So when we're looking at GPT-3 and ChatGPT, the big question is like, it's vaguely magical. You're like, what the heck is going on? The big picture is these are AIs, okay? And the lingo that you want to pay attention to when you're talking about artificial intelligence is that AI is a very, very big, like overarching term. And AI includes the fields of machine learning. So machine learning, you've probably seen a lot of statistical things. A question in the chat, does it work in other language besides English? The answer is yes. You can actually use it If you're taking like an introductory Chinese course or Spanish course or something like that, you can have it respond in a language that you select. So you can machine learning is usually used in statistical approaches. So I use machine learning in my research pretty regularly when I'm trying to figure out whether or not there's a signal that differentiates normal from cancer. And then deep learning is a subfield of machine learning, which is itself is a subfield of artificial intelligence. Okay, so these terms get thrown around a lot, but this is sort of like the lingo that we need to know about. The specific type of model related to artificial intelligence that GPT-3 is built on is it's an artificial neural network. So it's a deep learning model called an artificial neural network. And it's called that because it's comprised of a set of little things called neurons. So this is a neuron. This is how they're usually depicted when they're making graphs of it. And basically, we've got a couple different inputs. You can have one or more inputs that go into one little node here. And then there's some output. What happens in this one little spot is there's an artificial intelligence process, which is basically a mathematical function, right? So it's going to do some mathematical transformations of these inputs where it's going to integrate them, weight them, invert them, transform them somehow, and then it's going to generate some output. It's called an artificial neural network because it's actually not just one neuron, it's a big set of neurons that exist in these different layers, where there's like the first layer where things get passed to, and then a hidden layer in the middle, and then another layer, and so forth. And at each step, what ends up happening is the data or the input signal ends up getting tweaked a little bit this way, a little bit that way, and then you get some output. And if you just, when you initiate this model the very first time, it doesn't work at all because a lot of these parameters are kind of randomly set. So what you need to do is you need to train the model, and the training it is the part that actually converts into something that works. And training involves working with known data. So you have to have a data set to start from where you're going to say, if I were to input this text in and I look at what the next word might be or what the response to a question would be, I actually have those data. So I've got, here's an input, here's an output, and you run it through this. And what it does is it's going to adjust some of the mathematical processes that occur within any of the nodes. It's going to tweak the way that the things are connected in order to make it so that this model, when it's faced with that one little input text, it makes an output text. So it's going to tweak the model to do that. Now, the trick is it doesn't just do this with just like one phrase or one sentence or one image. It's going to do it with trillions and trillions and trillions of them. And it's going to try to adjust the model to make it the best fit so that however much data you give it, it's trying to maximize getting the true as in like, this is what was in the training data set output here. And it's massive in the case of GPT-3. So GPT-3 actually stands for Generative Pre-trained Transformer, third generation. So that's the model that ChatGPT is built on. It has been trained on a large variety of data like Common Crawl. Common Crawl is it's a 501c3 nonprofit that has accumulated petabytes of raw information from the internet over the last 12 years or so. So it's a humongous repository of internet text data, web textbooks, and Wikipedia. So this is the training data set that it's using. So this is how they trained GPT-3. And again, they pre-trained it. So they basically picked a point in time, I think a year or two ago, probably. And they said, we've got all this data up to this point in time. We're going to train it because it's going to be incredibly computationally intensive. And then once it's trained, it actually doesn't require as much computer power just to run it, right? To just drop in an input, drop in an output. We're not tweaking anything in the middle. The interesting thing is that this little neural network that I'm showing here has a couple of nodes with a couple parameters that can be tweaked. GPT-3 is, I believe, currently the largest one that we are aware of, and it's got 175 billion parameters that are tweaked as it's being developed. So this is insanely complicated. The numbers are so big that they're unfathomable. So you're like, it's just everything. They trained the whole internet using GPT-3. The other interesting thing about these particular models, the deep learning artificial neural networks, is that they actually do scale with data. So some of the other types of algorithms don't normally scale well with data. They'll sort of hit some maximum utility function and you can add more data, but it doesn't change. In the case of deep learning, you can keep adding data to it, which explains why a lot of these big companies tend to be pretty hungry for tracking your data. these language models, not necessarily GPT-3, but artificial neural networks that are language models, are already here. Like you probably maybe have noticed these, right? And here's just a GIF of somebody starting to type something. And what you see is it's actually filling in the text for you. Like it's doing predictive text modeling. This is an example that we probably already noticed. If you use Gmail, if you use you're texting somebody and it starts giving you suggestions, that's a type of approach that we see here. So this is already in place in a lot of places. GPT-3 is just the same thing on steroids. And spoiler, it's not going anywhere. There was news last week. Microsoft is planning on bringing ChatGPT directly into its Office suite. So they're in the works right now. So it's not like you're going to have to go to ChatGPT to do this, when it's just going to be a built-in function in Office in Outlook. So you should be able to just click a button and then use these language models. So the genie is out of the bottle. Like there's this is what this looks like kind of from now on. There are definitely biases. There are definitely bugs. This is not perfect, but I'm not going to talk about that part. I'm going to pivot over a little bit. And I believe Joseph is going to take over next, and we'll go from there.
Thanks, Michael, and thanks to everyone who showed up for the talk today. I think this is something that's on a lot of our minds, so it's good to get a good group together here to talk about it today. I'm going to be facilitating the more interactive part of our program here today. And we're going to think about how we can make these new AI models work for us as educators. So what I'm going to be doing is sending you to breakout rooms in just a second. Burns, I don't know if you've got the slides. If we can go on to the next slide. We're going to first do a little bit of thinking about how we might make it work for us as educators, and then take a little time to think about how we might make it work for our students and in the classroom. So to a little teaser trailer, what's probably on a lot of your minds, and I've seen a little conversation in the chat already, is what does this mean for cheating? What does this mean for assigning papers? What does this mean for giving exams? We're going to go there eventually. Susan's going to be covering some of that territory. What we wanted to do before going there, though, is to think about this in a positive light and think in a positive way, and what might be the uses that we can make of this new tool. So here's some things that Michael and Susan and I have talked about and tried and experimented with using ChatGPT or other large language models like what we're looking at as educators. So here's some things that we've had variable success doing. And then what we're going to do in just a second is to send everyone to breakout rooms. So you're going to be able to talk about this for 4 or 5 minutes with each other, other uses, and then we'll see what kind of other strategies we can crowdsource and come up with. So drafting course assignments, again, are they going to be particularly original? No, but they will it'll do a fairly good job of getting you started with a course assignment. Lesson plans, you can absolutely ask it something like, what are some ideas for getting conversation started about the Iliad, and it will give you some ideas. Again, it will be variable. Not all of them are great, but it's perfectly capable of giving you a bullet point list of lesson plan ideas. All of us, I take it, spend a good chunk of our day drafting boilerplate language, whether this is for assignments, whether it's in emails, whether it's for policies. It absolutely does a good job of getting you started. Full disclosure, I have not used this for a letter of recommendation yet. I write a lot of letters of rec, as I'm sure a lot of you do as well. I haven't used it yet, so if any of my students are on the call, don't worry, I haven't done this for you. But it does a pretty good letter of recommendation too. So you can, especially if you feed it a little information, tell the bot what grade the student got in your class, what class it was, what you asked them to do, why you're recommending them. It will craft a pretty good draft of a letter that with some tweaks would be pretty manageable as a letter of recommendation. So what I want us to do now, these are just some ideas, and I didn't want to give you exhaustive ideas. What I want to do now, and again, we're really focusing on ourselves as educators, not on our students yet, and not yet for class assignments. That's going to be the next slide. What I want us to do now is to think about how we might put AI to work for us as educators in the work we do, preparing for the classroom, outside the classroom, that sort of thing. So I think Crystalline is going to send everyone to breakout rooms. If we could do breakout rooms okay, perfect. So if we can go join your breakout room for, I think, 4 or 5 minutes is what we'll plan on. Then we'll come back and see what we've come up with. So I will see you all back in this room in a few minutes.
Joe, just to clarify, this is not necessarily a assignments, but like, what could the AI do for you to help with your current workflow?
Thank you, Susan. Yeah, the next slide, and I'll send you to breakout rooms again in a second time, where we'll talk about using it in an assignment itself. Right now is how might you use it as an educator in the sort of materials that you've got to prep or preparing for class or things like that.
Great. I had it take a crack at a couple of letters of rec.
Welcome back, everybody.
A couple groups still have a hot 20 seconds left, so.
I will give them time.
Yeah. It's sort of the eternal question. Are you the kind of person who, when the pop-up says this breakout room will be closing in 1 minute, do you immediately bail or do you run down the clock?
Yeah.
All right, everyone is back.
Hi, everybody. Welcome back. Welcome back. Hope everyone had a good discussion with your breakout rooms about some ideas how to make our own workflow easier. Rather than debriefing right now, I want to jump right into the next slide and send you back to breakout rooms. If we could share screen again, whoever was sharing. Okay, perfect. Thank you, Michael. I want us to turn now to thinking about how we can use this in assignments. So again, what's the question at the back of a lot of our heads, I think, is how are we going to handle cheating? What does this look like for assignments that we're giving and students producing essays using the model? But before going there, what I want us to think about is how we might actually use this as a tool for learning in the classroom. So the QR code, if you want to pull it up there, it just should take you to a Google Doc of an assignment that Michael and I gave in a co-taught course we taught last semester. I'll tell you about that in just a second, but I wanted to give you a couple other ideas of the sorts of things I have in mind here, and then I'll send you back to breakout rooms and you can brainstorm ideas of how you might use this in the classroom with students as well. And then we'll do a little debrief after that second time in breakout rooms. So here's just a couple of ideas. And again, these are ones that I've personally used several of these or ones that I think could work fairly well. You can use it to generate discussion using a prompt. So you can ask students to write an essay on the lesson's topic of the day. And as you saw, the applicability and range of ChatGPT is really, really broad. So you can have it write you an essay on machine learning, have it write you an essay on psychopathy, have it write you an essay on free speech on campus. And it will absolutely do that. And it will produce a different essay for every single student. And I think that's a really helpful way of getting conversations started. Then students can be looking at what kind of essay did the model produce. You can talk about the content of the essay. You can ask the meta question of why do you think it produced an essay of this kind of thesis or this kind of perspective? What kind of data do you think was used to train on that it produced that kind of essay? And again, this is absolutely applicable to any of the subjects we teach, because as you've seen already, it's capable of producing essays on the spot on basically any topic. So I think that's one good use for it. Second one is, and again, one that I've used in the classroom, is have students try and chart the platform's limitations. This could be very general, as in try and get it to fail. See if you can give it a prompt that it doesn't do well. And all of a sudden you're queued up for a discussion about the limitations of AI. You're queued up for a discussion. Maybe I teach philosophy about what makes human intelligence distinctive, if anything, how it differs from AI intelligence. Or you could have something much more directed. So if there's a specific lesson that you have for the day, you can try and see what it will cover about that lesson, what it won't cover, what it's capable of mapping accurately, what it's not capable of producing content accurately for. And then the final one is, again, this is just if you want to take a look at it, the QR code should link you to an assignment that Michael and I used in this co-taught class. And it was a very meta assignment in that the prompt here was that students were required to produce an essay using ChatGPT about the ethics of using ChatGPT for schoolwork. So they first had ChatGPT produce an essay saying yay or nay to using the platform for classroom exercises. But then the substantive part of their essay was they had to look at the essay that was produced and think through both their experience of having produced an essay using this new tool, but then also about what they think about the ethics of actually having done that. So it's very kind of this multi-leveled assignment where we were encouraging them to use the model, but then actively reflecting on that use of a model and if it was something that they thought was actually ethically appropriate or not. So that was a more substantial substantive paper length kind of assignment that we crafted using ChatGPT. I want to send you now to breakout rooms for just maybe like 3 or 4 minutes, and then we'll have a little time to debrief before turning things over to Susan. But I wanted you to go back to breakout rooms for just a few more minutes and think through any applications. Again, this is not for our own workflow, but thinking through rather, how might you put this to use productively in a classroom and in a class that you teach. So if we can go back to breakout rooms.
Okay, your rooms are open. And we're doing really good on time. So I've got some folks coming back. And folks, if you're joining us a little bit early, you had a hot 30 seconds. Go ahead and maybe like, what was something that someone shared or an idea that you had, go ahead and share it in the chat. I'd love to sort of see what we're coming up with. And what might be some uses. All right, and everyone's back. And again, folks, it would invite you, what are some of the things that you came up with? Throw that in the chat. What's an idea that you heard that you enjoyed? And Joe, throw it back to you.
Yeah, thanks, Susan. Yeah, so like Susan said, if you want to throw up in the chat any ideas you came up with, either for your own workflow or for putting this to use in the classroom, we can crowdsource some good ideas here for the upcoming semester. I'll just share one that I've tried to use in the classroom that I think makes for a really interesting discussion, is that it turns out that when you ask it to analyze ethical problems, which I teach a lot of ethics classes, so this is something that is a big chunk of what I do in the classroom, it's very hand wavy. It's actually back-end programmed to not take strong stances about ethical issues. So the answer is always something along the lines of, there are many valid opinions about the question, and here's one side and here's the other side. And it will actually usually give good arguments for both sides, but very rarely say, and here's the side that's clearly the right way to side with. It tends to remain agnostic. So that sets us up with all sorts of good questions to talk about in class, about the ethics of having programmed this to remain agnostic about most ethical, religious questions, political questions, but also then give some really good content for discussion about, is it leaning one way or the other? Are any of the arguments good ones that it's given you? So that's just another example of one that I've used. But again, if you can throw up some ideas in the chat of other ideas that might work in your context, then everyone can see them. I think at this point, it's going back over to Michael for just a slide or two for a little bit extra from Michael.
Sure.
Yeah.
So this actually comes up to what you were just talking about, Joe, which is where the AI is giving like kind of wishy-washy answers, where it's sort of taking a very hard centrist approach to a lot of these things. This goes back to a prior slide when we're looking at this huge model where it's like, there's 175 billion different parameters that are being tweaked. Artificial neural networks are, as in their very nature, opaque. So the researchers who build these things don't actually really understand exactly what's happening in the middle. Okay, they know what goes in, they know what comes out, but what exactly is happening in the middle is a little bit unclear. And what that means is that OpenAI spent a really long time, they spent basically an entire year trying to put some bumpers on this thing, right? To say like, hey, maybe we don't want it to generate like a whole bunch of really horrible, violent, gory, hate speech, racism, stuff like that, right? But it's difficult to do because if you don't actually understand where is the racism node in here, right? Like that's not a thing that you can tweak. They kind of brute force it. And one of the ways that they force it is they'll actually build like a second artificial neural network that they use to interpret and parse the output to see whether or not it passes or it needs to be flagged. So sometimes when you're typing stuff into ChatGPT-3, and you can try this yourself, you can say something, write me a piece about why fill in the blank with some group are a bunch of degenerates, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And what it will do is it will either say, I'm not going to do that because it violates our terms of service, or it will do it. And then it will say, and just as a heads up, here is a flag that like there's something sketchy about this. You're doing hate crime. Please stop doing that. All right. So there are some bumpers in place. It is not a raw artificial neural network. They have tweaked it. They have manually gone in and tried to put some things in place. All right. So we talked about that. A big question that everybody wants to know is, if I have students and they're doing a piece of homework, can we check to see whether or not the essay that they wrote was made by an AI or by human? Okay, and the answer is sort of. A student, I forget, at Cornell, I think maybe somewhere, I don't remember, actually wrote a piece of software called GPT-0. So you can go to the GPT-0, Princeton. Thank you, Kristen. Thank you, Gabby. You can go to the GPT-0 website, and what you can do is you can test this for yourself. So you can say, I'm going to go to ChatGPT, and I'm going to have it write an essay, and I'm going to copy that text, and I'm going to throw it into the web interface for GPT-0, and it's going to tell me yes or no. Okay, great. There is a little bit of squishiness, though. People testing this have found that while GPT-0 does accurately identify whether the text was generated more accurately than if it was just randomly guessing, like maybe whatever, it is also often wrong. Okay. Okay. So in other words, it's not as straightforward as a plagiarism checker. It's not perfect. And that's going to cause all sorts of hangups if you're trying to say like academic misconduct, stuff like that. Right. So just as a heads up there, and I've actually heard coverage as well that OpenAI itself is building a tool internally to attempt to identify the output of its own products. So there's more in this realm, but this is where we're at right now.
Yeah. And Lee, to your question, yeah, I'll have folks, but no, turn it in, we'll catch it. So especially on that news, that it can't be caught. Some of you now, I want you to take a second and kind of check in to see how you're feeling right now. Some of you all might be like, this is a tool, I can use it, thinking about how to channel this. Others of you might be in a state of real terror for the nature of education. So don't panic. This is my friendly reminder from the spirit of Ignatian pedagogy and sort of broader stuff. Thank you, Jim, for getting my reference, to not panic, right? The most useful information that you can ever be given. That's from Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. All right, this is why we shouldn't panic. Next slide, please. And why this is not the end of education. Oh, there we go. So one, as we have highlighted in several ways, there are limitations to this algorithm. There are things and pieces it can't get, in addition to elements of personal opinions, experience, the rest of it, that cannot be replicated. Other elements and pieces of style are there as well. As a test, I just asked it to write a poem in the style of Emily Dickinson. And while subject matter, length, and a little bit of tonality was pretty similar, all of the punctuation was commas. And nothing had any sort of irregular capitalization, right? So some of these really sort of key elements of potentially style might not be there as well. And again, it's inconclusive and sometimes it is wrong, right? And I think this is the piece where our students are going to also think about that. This is not a guarantee, right? But I think what this points to is the anxiety in particular that we may have around cheating and the rest of it. So next slide, if we could. I actually asked GPT, and I know it's a little narrow in there, whether or not using it was cheating, and or if we could ever stop students from cheating. It actually, GPT itself had a lot of really great suggestions about how to potentially think about ways to sort of reduce academic dishonesty or encourage students to engage in that. So even our AI overlords themselves can also sort of recognize this. Next slide. So I think in general, too, this is a great invitation, whether we're talking about AI and artificial intelligence, specifically in the classroom, or just issues around academic dishonesty and where it pops up in our instruction. And I don't want this to be taken as being perceived to sort of diminish that importance, but I do want to invite us for a second to just sort of think about how we're approaching it, because I do think this points to a larger conversation around what we maybe perhaps fixate on when we're thinking about academic dishonesty. So one quick book recommendation I want to make, Cheating Lessons by James Lang. It's a book that specifically looks at academic dishonesty. But I want to invite us to sort of reframe how we approach cheating. One, I think this is the thing. Student reasons for cheating are really complex. They run the gamut. I think it can be easy to reduce student reasons for this to laziness or moral failings. I have some interesting statistics I can share with folks later if they're sort of curious about this that would sort of point to otherwise, but just that there are sort of complex elements and aspects to that. One of the other things that Langs argues is there's always going to be new ways and tools. As soon as we sort of address or come to one, students are adaptive, they're quick, That is why we are so excited to work with them in the classroom, and they will adapt and move forward. So I think was it NYU or was it Columbia, Michael, that said, okay, we are banning access to GPT on our networks, right?
It was New York public schools
we
districts. Yeah. So
Yeah,
all
so
the public schools all banned or blacklisted the OpenAI websites.
Yeah, so can't use them, not possible on our network. As those students have no access to internet via their phones, via a firewall, via a coffee shop, via the local Starbucks, right? So already that's there. I think it's going to be impossible to fully monitor, and also the extensive energy to fully monitor it might put you in a direction that I think either is going to take you away from your teaching or might lead us into arenas that we don't like. I'm thinking about some of the security softwares that I know were marketed to me a great deal during testing during the pandemic. And certainly we have lockout browsers, but there were some when folks realized, again, a student could easily like pull up a smart device or something else that were tracking pupil movement or using multiple cameras, which, yes, could keep a student honest about cheating, but really moves this for me into an area of surveillance that I'm not comfortable with in terms of a values-based education. Maybe you are, I'm not. So, and then the other thing that I think this invites us to think about is that cheating generally, or maybe something like ChatGPT, is going to be most effective when instruction is really rigid and it's stagnant, right? And so the ways in which you can sort of open up your instruction, think about that. I think it might be sort of helpful. So here's a consideration I would invite you to do. Consider reframing some of your assignments, right? So whether it's adapting specifications grading, whether it's looking at, again, I think Joe and Michael's example of having them address or critique what was wrong in the essay and both talk about their experience of going through it. Part of this is also really, I saw on there earlier, someone had talked about their made up references was a great way to sort of reverse engineer to teach students how to do good research, right? So there are ways, I think, for us to realize how the way students are using these tools might be a way for us to continue to get at what is important and what we want to convey. And again, incorporating student voice, right? The bots and AI cannot replicate their own experience and their own opinions. And so how do you really continue to empower that? And then finally, I think the other piece is, and I would invite you all to see this, this is a tool, right? This is going to be one tool amongst many, and it's having its day. I remember 8 years ago when Twitter was the trending tool, and every single class you had to have a students adopt a Twitter and they had to tweet and everything. And one, not only is it was it not integrated well into most of the syllabi that I saw, I think it got us into some murky areas around speech and the rest of it. And it was also pretty boring and ineffective in terms of instruction, right? And not a great use for that tool. There is a really great way to use Twitter and have students use Twitter to go along with your classroom. But maybe like tweeting at one another is not it. Same thing here. This will be a tool that a lot of people will adapt and either fight against or include in their syllabi. And it may take a year or two for us to figure out what the best usage is. But as we lean into, again, conveying and creating that atmosphere, we're going to be able to kind of lean in and find where we need to hit. And that's a space where this is always, again, I like to get some Ignatian pedagogy and philosophy in there. So this is an invitation to what's called Ignatian indifference, which is sort of this idea that we predispose ourselves towards everything in the world, not as this is good, this is bad, this is evil, this is a sure and perfect way to get to something, but rather, how is this leading me either closer toward, and again, from the church, like St. Ignatius's perspective, he would say God. I would also invite folks who that language doesn't resonate, the good, what is true within them, etc., what's generative, what's life-giving. How is this leading me towards what's generative and life-giving? How is this distracting me from it? Right? So if you are fixating on whether or not students are using ChatGPT to answer questions on some of your homework assignments, and you find yourself increasingly oriented towards them in an angry and diminishing way, if it's sucking up all of your time, if it's making you miserable, chances are that's not something, a place for you to be spending your time. And instead, where you can orient it towards it as a tool or something that could potentially generate a lot of interesting discussion in your classroom, I think it could be really great. All right, and then one last slide for me, just as a little dig. So just remember, the robots will remember who welcomed them and who did not. And then I'll flip it back to Michael and Joe.
Excellent. Thank you, Susan. Thank you, Joseph. Thank you, moderator. We have a little bit of time at the end. The chat is doing a very good job sort of highlighting a lot of really interesting points. I'm perfectly functional, like fielding questions or sort of talking about how this is. I think Meg, I think in the chat highlighted that like there's not going to really be an effective way to avoid this. As I mentioned early on, like Microsoft is going to be incorporating this into their tools shortly. So like, unless you want to ban Word and like just have everybody do handwritten assignments, like it's kind of here. Google itself is probably unlikely to roll in OpenAI's model, but Google has its own model on the back end that they are sort of piloting and are probably going to roll out as well, because this is what's happening. Final point. In the chat, we were also talking about like training data. So the AI is aware of things that happened on the internet and in Wikipedia up till the point when the training of the model happened. And stuff after that, it's like, I have no idea what you're talking about. So one way to do this is if you have a very specific assignment that you want students to reflect on, make a current event. Basically say, let's talk about this thing that happened last week. And you can ask the AI to sort of frame it for you, but it's not going to be aware of what the actual factual details are of that particular event. Anybody have any questions or feedback or pressing images that they would like to share?
Also, too, I just want to call it, we've had some really great commentary in the chat talking about how this could be a great tool to help students focus on revision and editing. Again, I think, media literacy, good research, being able to verify sources more and more is becoming important, not just across students pursuing an academic career, but in life, so that we have a successful for the health of our democracy. And so this can be another great tool for that. I saw some people advocating for flipped classrooms, identifying that, again, like it cannot speak to their personal experience. Yeah, any other thoughts, or have you used this in the classroom before as well? Feel free to share.
I think one other thing I wanted to add is that, especially in the last semester, our students all do know about this and are actively using it, whether it's just for fun or in the classroom. Who knows the extent they're using it, but Michael and I were teaching this beginning of last semester. So in September, where it was new to a lot of students. And by the end of last semester, we were getting emails left and right from students saying, hey, that thing that we did at the beginning of the semester, now it's everywhere. And all my friends are emailing me about it. So I feel like I was ahead of the curve. So I think we can safely say by the beginning of this coming semester, it's sort of achieved a cultural status where especially our students are in these waters and know about it and have tried using it.
And also just as a quick shout out to Meg Doherty's point around technology and moral panics. Again, as someone who is of a certain age, I remember again when, like laptops created a moral panic in the classroom, and then it was email, and then it was the internet. And again, before me, it was television. Before that, it was rock and roll. Before that, it was radio. And before that, it was the novel that ruined young Werther. So we, I think, again, just it's important to have a level of indifference and engagement with this as a tool. Yeah, calculators, absolutely. Thanks, Lawrence.
Susan, on that point, could I just ask a question about sort of the opposite part of cheating?
Mm-hmm.
Does this raise a question for us about what do students even need to know themselves? Because I mean, to me, it's kind of like a really big, different version of spell check. Do I really need to know how to spell things correctly if the computer is always going to correct my spelling? Yeah. So or anything really that students can say, well, I can just look that up. Why do I need to know it?
Yeah.
So I wonder if people are thinking about that, if we're wrestling with like, does this change not just how you're going to check whether or not students have learned what you're hoping they will learn in the class, but also what they need to learn at all, totally.
Well, Claire, I'm biased obviously towards engaged and experiential learning, right? But I think all the points that you're bringing up, where we can encourage and engage students to integrate their knowledge or to see where it is playing out in the real world, or to give them a sense of what the skills that they are learning, how it will serve them or will be building blocks for sort of the later pathways in their life. is one, going to help them take it more seriously, but also the integration itself helps lead it towards significant learning. Again, I want to shout out some of the great folks who are members of the STEM faculty learning community. I hear constantly how they are both engaging with students who I think are a little frustrated at some of these foundational skills that they're being asked to learn, and are always really taking the time to lay it out for them. So I think the more we're transparent even to a student about this foundational knowledge, which I am having you memorize, is going to set you up to then be successful, whether it's in this arena, in this job, or even in this really foundational class for the MCAT later, right? So that's why I think, again, as you talked about flipped classrooms, any aspect or place where you can connect, especially if you're teaching a class with a lot of foundational knowledge, which may or may not be more likely to be a place where ChatGPT might pop up. How can you connect it back to the engaged lives of our students?
I was going to say one other thing too, Claire, and I think that one thing that we found this last semester, and I don't know if this generalizes, but I think getting ahead of it in a way pushes students to then answer that question for you, right? So produce essays using this. Think about, I had my students apologize to a friend for skipping a coffee date using ChatGPT, and it came up with a really good text for them to send. And they're like, I don't think I would send this, right? And okay, well, why? What's it lacking? And they were able to answer that question back to me of, well, it's lacking my personal style, and sort of part of the project then was articulating, what can this tool do and what do you lose by using it? And yeah, I think kind of by getting ahead of it, I think the students then are able to see the limitations, but also how they can use it.
Any other questions or thoughts?
One thing, and that is, if you're in the freshman level and you're trying to teach people, I understand what you mean about putting things out there, showing them why it's important. But don't we also have a responsibility to show them how to learn? Mm-hmm. And so I understand that this is one facet of that. But I think I get worried. I've talked to 18-year-olds who only use a computer and don't read a book. Yep. Or, or you say, what do they need to know? Do they really need to understand the periodic table of elements? They can just look at it. But unless you engage them and ask them to learn a vocabulary, use it and move forward, I'm a little concerned about that.
Yeah, and Megan, absolutely. I think you're tapping into what we've been talking about, right? That this is not a replacement for instruction, right? This is a complement to it. So I think you can have a student access some of this information and also talk about why this is essential. For me, again, my area is philosophy of education, particularly around democracy and civic democracy. I'm like, this points directly at how do we get more and more folks, I think academically, engaged in media and digital literacy, which is then going to improve their lives as citizens, right? And so I see that as a doorway to move towards exactly what you're talking about, right? It's not just the utility, but it's the utilization and it's the learning of the skill, right? It's the integration of it.
And Ian's got their hand up.
Students won't spend the time to learn the language so that they can apply it later. That's one of my major concerns.
Yeah. And I think that's why, as much as we can, how does that show up in your assignments? Yeah, we do what we can.
Ian, did you have something to contribute?
Yeah, just to Megan's point, which I think is quite important. We've been talking here about using ChatGPT for text generation rather than in dialogic formats, in actually chatting. And I found it quite interesting to engage it in chat that I think has shown to me that it doesn't actually think, right? And should be able to show students what thinking is by engaging the bot in a chat and showing them what they're able to do that it can't. So moving beyond the just, give me a text, give me an email that I don't want to write, to follow-up questions.
Well, and Ian, I think on that point of what is quintessentially human and what cannot be replicated, I can't think of a better note to end on. So again, Joe had a slide up with our emails feel free to reach out. Would love to be in conversation to continue to see how you use this, right? I think as a scholar of teaching and learning, I think we're going to see a lot of articles coming out about how this is used in our pedagogy. And so would love to be on the front end of writing some of those with you also. If this is interesting to you and you're using it, let's get it out there and talk about how we can do good human-centered instruction with AI.